Good afternoon, and welcome to another segment of Art with the Armory with AARP Alabama and the Armory Learning Arts Center of Montgomery. I'm Ann Hales with AARP Alabama. Today we're going to play with watercolors. So grab your watercolors if you have them, some watercolor paper, a cup of water, and let's get ready. While you're doing that, I really want to remind everybody that we host these projects each month with the Armory Learning Arts Center in Montgomery. And next month, we have another fun one coming up on November 17th. We'll explore soap making and sugar scrubs just in time for the holidays. Make great gifts. And if you have watched any of these other segments, you know we've done some that would also make good gifts. So you can always go back to our Facebook page, our YouTube, AARP Alabama YouTube page to look for those projects and watch them again. And get some good ideas. But today we are going to do our watercolor art, and it's going to be a lot of fun. A little bit later in the broadcast, I will run a short video about our events for next week. So stay tuned and stay on to the end because we do want to highlight, we've got a lot of things coming up next week that I know that you'll want to take part in. But let's get to what we're here for. I'd like to introduce to you Sally Chambliss. Sally is a former Lamp High School art instructor. She graduated from Auburn University with a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Graphic Design. Welcome, Sally. Oh, I can't hear you. Can you? I hope we're not having audio problems. Dorothy, can you, I've got another one on, can you hear us? No. Sally, so everybody hang tight. We're going to try to find out where she's going to come back in again, and we're going to see if we can't connect to this audio. We have been playing with technical issues for a couple of days with this, and we thought we had it worked out.
Let me in again. There we go.
There you are.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. Welcome, Sally. It's so good to have you.
I just did a little refresh, so we'll just refresh if it happens again.
If it does happen again, and you know, with this technology, sometimes it gets a little glitchy. So we've learned that we just have to leave and come back in sometimes. We want you to be able to see it. So before we start, I do want to, there are a couple other reminders. If you have any questions, please put those in the chat. We'll get to those as soon as we can. Sally's going to break as she sees them. If we see some good questions, we'll put them up. Also, if you have suggestions on other art events that you would like to see it next year as we're planning for these art events, put those in the chat. Put your suggestions, what kind of art you would like to do. And we have another event tonight. Besides the video that we're going to show you that shows some events coming up next week, we have one more really neat event tonight. It is the last of the Alabama Musicians Live from Home series. It's classical music tonight with flute and piano at 7 o'clock on Facebook and YouTube. So come back to this page and watch Barbara Harrington and Jennifer Hartzell, both of Birmingham, who will be featured tonight on the Facebook page. So tune in a little bit before 7 so that you won't miss anything. So Sally, I think we've got our cameras set up, and what I'm going to do is put, let me make sure I've got this. I want everybody to be able to see this. That's where she's going to be painting, and then I'm going to silence myself so that I don't interrupt anything. And in fact, I'm going to kind of go out and let you have it, Sally.
Okay. All right. Thanks. If you were able to pick up a packet and you have the supplies on hand from the AARP packet, you would have had a drawing of 2 pumpkins and some optional leaf drawings and some little curlicue vines. If not, you can sketch your own pumpkin. You probably learned how to do that in 3rd grade. So you can sketch out a pumpkin on watercolor paper. If you just have type and paper and you have any color, you can do it as a practice run and then do the real thing on watercolor paper later. So what we've gotten prepared is a light sketch, I think you can see it enough, of the 2 pumpkins, and I added in one of the pumpkin leaves. And we're going to start with the color of the pumpkin first, and depending on how much time we have, we'll move through from the pumpkin to the leaf to the background. So also in 3rd grade, you probably learned how to color mix. And with color mixing, you can experiment and find many different options instead of painting orange strictly from the palette. These are all the different ones I laid on the paper while Anne was doing the introduction. You can create yellower pumpkins, red or orangier pumpkins. This one right here was created with a hot pink and a yellow. So be creative, have fun, play with some color mixing. And you did get 2 sheets of paper if you picked up the packet, so you can do one for fun today and one after the class is over. When you're working with watercolor, you want to let the water be the workhorse. You don't want to dig into the paint and have more paint than you do water. There's also a couple of different techniques. You can start with clean water on your brush and wet the paper with just water where you intend to paint the color of the pumpkin. And I'm going to show you how that reacts, and then show you how it reacts on dry paper. So I'm going to put a little red down first and let you see how the water flows. This is called a wet and wet technique. And the water will flow onto the paper and not soak directly into the paper. Now that's how the red will work if you add water first. Now I'm going to swap over to the other side and show you how the red reacts if you do the paint directly to the paper. So it's going to, well, let me add a little more paint. It's going to soak in faster and not have the flow that it did on the right side. What also happens if you add the paint to dry paper is if you get staining effects, those aren't necessarily movable later. Like this dry, stronger red mark may move later and it may not. But these that had wet paper prior to the application of the paint will tend to move and flow and let you add color easier. So now I'm going to go to a yellow because we know red and yellow will give us a nice orange. And I'm going to go into that paint where I had the red wet on wet. And now I've got a nice vibrant color of a pumpkin. Now, if you want to be really artsy and crazy with your colors, you can do a purple pumpkin and a yellow pumpkin. So you can do the colors. I saw your palette had a really nice lavender color, and I'm going to move this wet, clean water over into the rest of the pumpkin, and I'm going to go back to my orange, pull some on top. So if you feel like you want to have a variegated color pumpkin, you can layer your colors and make sure that the water is being the active process. You don't want to have straight paint onto the paper. If you have too much paint and not enough water, when water touches it, it's going to flow and bloom other parts of the paper where you don't intend it to go. So I like the colors that are happening right here. I like the vibrancy of the yellow fitting in there. I'm not sure how close. I'll lift it up a little bit so you can see all the colors. So one side has more water. This side that was dry, I'm going to go back into the back part of the pumpkin. More than likely, that would be a little darker, a little in shadow. So I'm going to take the red, and I'm going to lay red down into the deeper parts where the shadow crevices might be behind that stem. So I'm going to let some red sit for just a minute, and then I'll add some of the yellow on top. But the stronger of the two colors is the red, so the stronger value is what you want to place first if you need the shadow in place. Now I'm going to let that sit, leave it alone and let it dry in, and the paper can absorb. Now let's move over to this little pumpkin in the front. I think if you want to play an experiment, there are some pumpkins that have some green, sort of yellow-green places that aren't quite ripe yet. I'm going to make this one have some little yellow-green ridges where this pumpkin may not quite be ripe enough for pumpkin pie. So I'm going to follow my drawn line with this yellow. This is called a yellow ochre. It's not a true yellow. It's a real earthy yellow. So I'm going to follow some of my little pumpkin lines. And pumpkins are, the lines in pumpkins are so organic, you don't have to have a perfectly drawn pumpkin. My pumpkin will be different from Miss Ann's, different from Margaret's. So you can sketch a pumpkin and it's going to have its own organic shape, and it doesn't have to be a certain shape to be a pumpkin. So I've got this yellow ochre, and now I'm going to move into a little bit of green. I happen to have some green on my palette from a previous project. So I'm going to take that green and I'm going to let it ride right along that ridge where I had the yellow ochre. So this pumpkin may not quite be ripe for picking, and I'm going to go back in with my yellow ochre and blend those colors. You can see how my colors are flowing, and that's because you want the water to move the paint for you. You don't want to have to put the paint on and then add water to let the paint do what it's supposed to do. Now I'm going to take some dry, see if I can find some dry green on here, and show you what happens if you don't have enough water on the paper. I'm not sure this will work because it's a habit for me to use more water for the process. So let's see if we can make this. I'm going to move over here to the edge, just to the outside edge, maybe down here on the ground. And I want you to see what happens if you have a lot of paint and not much water. So we're going to let that dry, and it should stain the paper and not move around later. But if you use more paint than water, you're going to get paint that moves later, because anytime water touches it and it hasn't had that nice balance of water to paint, if water touches a heavy painted area, it's going to tend to move as it touches water, if that made sense. Okay, now I'm going to go back to this yellow ochre pumpkin, the one that's not quite ripe yet. I'm going to try to add a little extra paint. There we go. There's some heavy application of paint. Do I need to slow down? Am I going too fast? If I am, put it in the chat and I'll slow down a little bit, because we're going to come back and cover some other areas. There's that really strong yellow color. So with watercolor, you can have it as bright and strong as you want, but not necessarily because of more paint. It's just the color. You still want your water to be what does the work for you. So now I'm going to add water to my brush. I'm dipping over here into this little jar of water. I'm going to add water to the brush, and I'm going to be able to move this paint that is already on there. Once this paper is wet, the paper tends to hold the moisture if it's the right kind of water, if it is watercolor paper. Some paints will not absorb the water and it just makes your paper wrinkle. But watercolor paper is made to hold the moisture and wait for you to add more paint. So it's made to hold the moisture and let you add as you go. So now we can shape our little pumpkin. I'm going to bring that color on around. And see how, I know it's over years and me loving watercolor, but you don't have to be controlled with the brush. You don't have to outline this little section and come back and fill it in. Just let your hand be loose. Don't hold the brush tight. There's a little fat part on the brush right here, and that's where you want it to sort of flutter in your fingers. You don't want a tight grip. The tighter your grip, the more control and the less flow you have with the mood of your painting. So you want to really let this paint flow because of water, and you want your fingers to move gently. You want it to have some freedom to move and let your brush. If you hold this paintbrush way down here on the metal ferrule, you're also covering what your eyes need to see as you paint, because you're having to look over and under. So if you hold your brush back here with the fat part where the fingers go, you can see where your brush needs to move. All right, I'm going to leave these two pumpkins alone for a minute, and we need to find our stems. If you want yours to have a green stem, you can put a green stem. If you're looking for a brown stem, I don't know that your palette has a brown on it. I don't remember seeing it on there. But any brown that you want to make for trees, leaves, anything where you need to create a brown, you use two complementary colors. Complementary colors are colors opposite on the color wheel. So if you can just remember red and green because of Christmas colors, red and green will always make a brown. You can pre-mix those on the lid of your palette, or you can paint a little red and paint a little green. So I'm going to show you what it looks like if we mix. I'm going to put a little bit of red. I need to dry my brush a little bit. So if you need to dry out your brush, dab it on your paper towel. Now I'm going to take a little green, and you can see how it neutralizes. So any two complementary colors, it's kind of coming out gray. Any two colors opposite each other on the color wheel will neutralize. And it doesn't mean equal amounts, like it's not half red, half green. They have to neutralize each other within the value of the colors. I'm going to add a little more green to that. So if you're interested in learning more about the color wheel, you can make any brown by using two opposite colors. So let's go a little more green back in there. I mean red. We got some green. I probably need to let that blend a minute. Now it's going kind of grayish. Can y'all see that going out kind of gray-brown? I'm not sure what color it looks like on your monitor, but it should be making a soft gray-brown. Remember, I had these little shadows and crevices in my pumpkin. That can also be where you see the darkness of the way the form of the pumpkin is, the crevices. So while I've got that in my brush, I'm going to come in and put some of those little crevices right where my lines were drawn. And I can steal the paint from where I had my stem. I can rob the paint from there because it's not dry and add it and add some of the depth to that form of the pumpkin. So you don't want to create exact lines. You just want to add the dimension and create the form of the pumpkin. Are there any questions yet? Everybody's painting. Okay. So I'm going to go back into my little stem, add some depth over here. And like I said, you don't want to outline perfect lines. You just want to give the idea that there's form and shape of the pumpkin. So I'm going to take a little bit of red and come back in here. Now, my pumpkin does not want to be all one color. I wanted it to be free-flowing and have some pumpkin colors, but not all the same. So back in here where we laid that red, we were letting the paper absorb that red paint. Now that really pretty yellow I had in pumpkin number 2, I'm going to take this yellow and I'm going to add it to the back of the red. Once the red has settled into the paper and absorbed, this color won't mix as much with it. It'll become a transparent layer. With watercolor, you can layer as many as 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 layers, but they have to be dry to create a glaze. And with glazing effects, that's how watercolor creates very translucent passages of light. And the science behind that is the light passes through the first layer, the second layer, hits the white of the paper, and then bounces back. And that's why watercolors look so luscious. I mean, they just have that transparent look, and the colors flow, the light flows through one color to the other. There's another word I'm looking for. I'll think of it in a minute. It's not luscious. It's a science word. It'll come to me tonight. So I'm taking the yellow that I used in this pumpkin, and I'm adding it to this first layer of red. One thing you want to think about if you are a painter or you want to get into painting is the colors that you use in one place of your work, you want to repeat those in other places. You don't want them to be alone and seen only in one spot. You want to let those colors migrate around your painting so that they don't seem like they grab your attention in one place and they don't appear anywhere else. So these yellows and reds that I'm using, I want to go back and grab that same color family, and I can brighten and create depth of color. Even on top of those ridges where we painted the neutral, you can go back and draw on top of those with your paint, because that paint was darker in value, so it's not going to move. Now, if you have a color you want to remove, you take a clean brush, clean water, and you can kind of go in and sort of massage that little area. I'll show you right here. I'm moving this around with the clean water on my brush, and I'm going to dry the brush out with paper towel. And look, you can go in and remove nearly half of that red paint just by picking it up with clean water. See how it's picking up? So you can remove paint. Let's say you just get a little bit more than you really wanted, and we took out 2/3 of that red paint. So certain colors will let you, are forgiving, and they will let you remove the color. So let's say if I didn't want that red, I'm going to go back in and add some of that yellow now. And because it's wet, where I used the clean water to take away the red, it's going to accept the next color just because it was already wet. I'm painting real loose. I know that some of you might have gone in with a really small brush. The smaller the brush, the longer it takes. Okay. So if you are painting with a brush that's more like, let's see, more like this size compared to mine, and there's technical things about brushes. I like painting with an 8 or a 10, and the brush sizes are usually on the just above the ferrule, the metal part. And there's good brands, there's cheap brands. I like to teach painting like you would a sport. If you wanted to learn how to play tennis, but you went to the dollar store and looked for a tennis racket, your game's not going to be as good as if you went to the sporting goods store and got a good racket. So if you can afford one good brush, a 6 or an 8 is a good medium size, and this little brush is only a size 3. So depending on the area you tend to cover with paint, that's how you need to pick your brush size. You could still paint these pumpkins with a small brush, but you saw how fast I was moving it around, and I don't have any little tiny detail areas, so I don't need a small detail brush. Now, if I get ready to paint these little curly Q vines, then I might want to move to the small brush. While we're talking about brushes, the tip of your brush on a round brush can do just as much detail as this little tiny brush. The trick is to hold it on its tippy toes and do the work from the tip toe of the brush or from the point, and not drag and press your brush down. When you're actually painting, you only want to use the bottom half or third of your brush to apply the paint. So even though your brush may be loaded with water and paint, you're letting gravity pull the paint down to the point where you're using the water. So you don't have to, I'm going to show you like a third grader, you don't have to smush this brush down like this to get paint out of it. If you do that, you're also going to mess up your bristles if you invest in a good brush. Okay, now we've got some of these places dry. I'm going to move to this little stem and over to the vines and the leaves. Did we have any questions yet? Okay. Somebody says, this makes watercolor look so much less scary. Yay! I think watercolor is one of the easiest paint techniques to learn because it is forgiving. There are colors that are staining colors, but if you start with a small palette, if you have all transparent ultramarine and alizarin, the scary part comes when you use paints that stain, and they're really vibrant and they're pretty, but they don't let you massage with clean water and take it off the paper. But they're necessary sometimes. They make great, nice neutrals and dark grays if you have those staining colors. So let's move on to the little brown of this stem, and then we'll move to the vine and the leaf. So for my stem, I'm going to go back to green. I'll do it in reverse this time. Last time I used red first and then added the green. So this time I'm going to use some green. So I'm going to find my little stem. It's sort of gray already. Maybe I have a little red in my brush. I think I may leave it that color. It's kind of a gray-green. And while I have this nice color, I'm going to add those ridges in my pumpkin. And this paper is holding the moisture. Mine's still got some moisture and it's still wet. And there's where my shadows will be, down in the deep part of the pumpkin. And we're going to move around. I'm going to add a little more green to my brush. And remember, this is the deeper part in the center of the stem. So I might need a little extra green just to show the depth of that shadow. So I'm going to bring in a little extra. There we go. I'm going to see if you can see that up close. So I brought the depth of the shadow right in by the stem. My stem looks a little light in color, and that's because the white of the paper is showing through. That's only one layer of paint, and this is probably 2 or 3, maybe even 4 passes of the paint. And this is only one sweep of paint, so it looks real transparent. To darken that up, I'm going to go grab a little extra green from this messy palette, and I'm going to add, there we go. Now it's not showing so much the white of the paper. But the white of the paper is what makes it really luminous and makes it have that glow. Now, this is where some people get scared. See where these two people, these two pumpkins are supposed to touch each other? This pumpkin is behind this one. So I need some shadow color there to show that the smaller pumpkin is in the foreground and the brighter orange is in the background. I'm going to leave this little bit of green on my brush, and I'm going to come in right in behind pumpkin number 2, and I'm going to add a little bit of that green, but I'm going to take my brush with clean water and I'm going to move it out. So if I only have clean water, it's going to dilute the green and move it out into that orange. I think it needs to be a little stronger to show the shadow. I'm going to add a little more. But where two objects touch in your painting, if you're scared to paint them together, you're scared they're going to touch, it shows up like a halo between one object and the next, and that grabs more attention than if you accidentally paint the wrong color. Yes. So now I've got that shadow color, and that makes this pumpkin look like it sits in front of, but it also joins them by the color. So now I don't have a halo between the two where it looks like I was scared to paint it. I think I need a little more yellow right there. Now, if this inspires you and you're ready to go check out some watercolor paper and some brushes, one thing important about watercolor paper is the weight of the paper. When you're just experimenting and learning, you can use 80-pound paper. And the weight of the paper is the higher the number per pound weight. If you were doing a large painting, you would want heavier paper so you wouldn't have to stretch it. They also sell watercolor paper on what are called blocks, where the paper itself, around the edges of where it's put into the pad, there's like a glue that holds like maybe 12 sheets tight so that the water doesn't make the paper waffle. A lot of times when you paint with watercolor, the paper gets all ripply and waffly. This one's holding up pretty good. But the thinner the paper, the more waffle or movement you will get. Now, there's a science lesson there, too. Anything that happens to the front side of the paper needs to happen to the back side if you want it to lay flat. Some watercolor artists, if they're painting a large painting, will take a spray bottle like this, and they'll just spritz the back and the front, and then just lay it on a tight surface like a piece of plexiglass or a piece of masonite board. But whatever happens to the front needs to happen to the back if you want it to not have that ripple and waffle to it. And you can use any kind of little spritzer bottle. I like this little one because it puts a fine mist. But you can use, you can actually go to the kitchen sink on a clean sink and run it under water front and back, hold it up, let it drip all 4 sides, and then just lay it on a flat surface. So you could paint on a masonite table, a piece of glass, but that moisture helps it cling. But then you've had the physics of what happens to the front, happens to the back, and that's what helps keep it from waffling. You can also take your sheet of paper and use blue painter's tape and just tape it to a piece of cardboard to keep it flat, but you're still going to have a little bit of unevenness to the paper if you wet parts of it more or less than others. Okay, now let's move on to our little stems. How are we doing on time, ladies? We good? Doing good? Okay. You're going to have a masterpiece by 3 o'clock. Okay, let's take a little bit of that greenish gray. Mine's kind of already mixed on my palette as a greenish gray. Grab a little bit of yellow. And I'm not really sure, but I think these vines out in the field would probably be dried and brown by now. So I'm taking the tippy toe of my brush. I told you you can get a small line. I'm going to run it along that vine, and I'm going to press and lift. I don't want to put too much pressure on it, but if I go in one direction and press, I want to press down hard. I can see how you can widen that line by pressing down and then lift it up. So the pressure you put on the bristles makes the line wider, but the less pressure makes the line skinny. So I'm going to start on this little loopy end. I don't even know if you can see the pencil line. I'm going to take it small. I'm going to loop it. And I'm going to come back around with a little bit of pressure and make it fat. Kind of like calligraphy, if you've ever done calligraphy. So we're flipping and turning, but it's the pressure on the brush that makes the width of the line. Now let's go in and do our leaf. I don't think I want this leaf really bright, because if these pumpkins are ready for picking, it's probably sort of a brownish green. Would that be right? Brownish green? Okay. I'm going to take a little bit of yellow ochre, a little bit of green. Looks kind of yucky. That's a good art word, a yucky green. So I'm going to make the vein come right through the leaf. Now I'm going to add a little water. That's kind of strong. Huh? Can you hear me? Can y'all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Just wasn't sure.
I was afraid to come in because I was afraid it would take over the screen. So
no, it's all cut, all good. So I'm just kind of wiggling a little green paint, and I'm going to come back in with that yellow. Remember, the colors need to be seen in more than one place, so we're going to have some color, that same yellow or yellow ochre, and I'm going to bring it into that leaf. I'm going to bring in some yellow ochre, and now I have the same color in all 3 places. I'm going to drop a little bit right there in that vine. I'm just going to take it right off the edge of the paper, the shape of that leaf. Now, I have another little vine that I drew on mine down here at the bottom, and that was just for visual balance. So I'm going to paint that in. And if you didn't have a chance to draw the little vines, these were separately drawn on your sheet if you have the packet. So I just placed them where I wanted them to be. There was no right or wrong place for these. So those little vines, you can do them and not have the vines at all. You can just have a pretty blue background. So I'm going to add this stem. This is kind of a weak color. Another little art tip is if you painted these vines really bright and strong, they would take away from the star of the show. The star of the show are your pumpkins. So you don't want these really bright, pretty, fresh greens. You want them to be subtle. They're kind of the dancers on the side of the act. They don't need to take full front stage. So even if this one is less important than this one, that's okay. We don't want those vines or stems to take over too much attention. Now, do I have any questions yet? Anything? Nope. Okay. All right. If you want a background, I don't think I want any paint up here, but I would like to set these pumpkins in their place. I would like to set them down on the ground or on a table. I laid this green down here earlier for you to see how quickly it would adhere to the paper. So I'm going to see if it moves any. It's moving a little bit. But those are the stains you get. These will stain the paper. If you paint a color on dry paper and don't go back to it within 5 or 10 minutes, it will stain and not move as easily. So I wanted you to see how that would work. Now I'm going to take some brighter, prettier green. and we're going to put it in, I'm going to say like maybe a blue-green. We're going to lay in some color. Also, the complement of orange is blue. So I put any blue-green near my pumpkin, the orange is going to look brighter and stronger. So blues and oranges make each other look better, stronger, and they work well together, but they fight if they're right next to each other. So if you've ever gone down the street and read a billboard where the lettering was too hard to see, that's because of the colors that were used next to each other. So I'm going to lay this really pretty blue-green. It's going to blend well with this yellow, but it ought to really make this orange stand out. I want you to see. It's not too blue, but it's a nice, strong blue-green. So I'm going to bring it right around the edge of the pumpkin and down here. I don't know if it's showing up blue enough on your monitor, but you can see the color. It's stronger, it's more blue than it is green. So I'm going to bring a little water, some fresh water down to the edge of the paper. I'm going to be a little careful. I probably should have painted this before I did the stem, but that's okay. I'm going to get a little more extra blue and add that. So sometimes the background color of what you paint makes the colors you put on the paper show up better once that second or third color is added. Because if we had left this with a white background, our orange would have been less strong. I'm not sure if you can really even see it. Your artist eye can show you that the pumpkins look brighter, stronger when the background color is added. And I've had some students, because they love the painting so much, they're scared to add the background. But you do want to think about the color you choose instead of maybe not even what was in the photograph or the picture. Choose the color based on what will make the object look stronger. So I'm going to add a little bit more right back up here, and then I'm going to let it flow. Now, to make this look believable, I need a little more of this color to the right side so it looks like it's on a surface or it's in its environment. So the same blue-green, I'm going to bring over here and come around this pumpkin and bring it up to about the same height from left to right and place that in there. And as long as you let the water be the workhorse, you can go back and strengthen a color, or you can go back and adjust the color like to a grayer, not so bright color. But you've got to let the water help you control the paint and not have so much paint that when you touch it, I'm going to go ahead and paint this in, so that when you touch it, all your paint that you previously had in place moves.
Sally, you talked about that a little bit earlier, where you were talking about having too much paint or too strong a paint so that it, you know, what you were just saying. And at another point, you talked about the strength of the orange on the pumpkin and have a good, solid, bright color. Tell me a little bit about the difference when one's a little bit too much or what. Just differentiate, I guess, between what's strong and what's good to have, and when is it not good to have it that strong, or maybe it's a drier kind of thing you're talking about.
There you go, drier. So I'm going to show you on this little scrap that I started with. So I'm going to take my brush and rinse it, but I'm going to take a lot of the water out of the brush. I'm just going to pat it dry. So if I pat it dry and I go to my paint, let's go to that strong orange, and I touch it, I'm getting a whole lot more paint on these bristles. I don't even know if you can see it. There's a lot more paint on these bristles than there is water and paint. So if I take that color and I go to the paper, it's hitting the paper dry too. So there's times to use it that way, but see how much stronger. I've used probably 3 times more paint there than I did when I painted the orange on this whole section. But I can take it and just tap it in the water and watch how much paint's there, how much it moves. So if I had that amount of paint on a small area and I accidentally touched it with water, it's called a bloom. So let me show you what will happen. Might not do it right away, but I'm going to put some water here. And it's going to grab that orange, but wherever it starts to dry, it's going to, there it goes right there. It's going to start a leach. into where the moisture is. There you go. So all that paint here that was very concentrated, by the time I added water to an area, it starts pulling to where the highest point of the moisture is. There's paint there, but it had nowhere to go because I put it on dry paper. But as soon as there's moisture close by, it'll move to that area. Did that help?
So it does. And so as we're learning, or as I'm learning how to do this, then your dark paint, if I want it darker, I sort of start lighter and do more layers to make it more vibrant as I'm, you know, instead of trying to get it all that same color at one point. Yes.
In fact, one thing I like to teach is you may have a palette with all those pretty colors, but you can get the most vibrant greens from making your greens instead of saying, the leaves on that tree are green, let me use green paint. And not all the tree leaves are the same green. You've got some in shadow, some new growth. So your best greens are made by mixing. And you can pick 3 different blues and 2 different yellows, just like on the pumpkin. I use some of the same yellow and some of the same red, but whatever layer you start with first, I keep showing with my hands, whatever layer you start with first determines what the second layer will look like. So one of the fun exercises you can do is take the yellow on your palette and paint yellow, yellow, yellow. Now go back and paint a version of green by putting a blue on the yellow, a different blue on the yellow, and you can learn how those yellows and blues work together to create your greens. And the same with oranges, you know. And by layering the colors, you're going to get that luminous effect and build kind of like layers of an onion. They're clear, you know, they're sort of translucent. So you're going to get more beautiful color by creating glazing effects and putting a thin layer and coming back with a second layer. If we had another hour and this began to dry, I would come back and probably lay some other yellow. There's a really pretty lemon yellow in this palette. And the brighter the color, the lighter effect you'll get. So if you have sunlight hitting anything, you always have yellow in your paint. If you have a shadow on anything, you're always going to have blue. So when I use that green to make the shadow colors, it's because it had blue in it. And I already had green on the palette. But the layering effects you can get with watercolor are what makes the colors stay bright and vibrant instead of one single color, mix the color you want and place it on the paper. It's not wrong, it's just not as pretty.
Okay. We've got a couple of other good questions too. Candy Williams asked, so blooms are bad? Is that a bad or just different?
It's a term that's used for when that water leaches. Sometimes it makes beautiful skies. So it's not a bad thing. It's just know it's going to happen if you have wet and wet. I used to love to collect children's books based on the illustrations. And there was one illustrator that I loved, and she used a lot of blooms in her children's books illustrations, but she knew how to make them work for her. There are other techniques you can do too, where if you have rubbing alcohol, you can take rubbing alcohol and drop it into the watercolor, and it moves the paint out of the way. It moves the paint away from the water, and you can get little techniques that way. You can also do a, hold on, my words are gone. Take a crayon and rub it onto the paper and do a crayon resist. If you do a white crayon, that's the white of the paper, you can create the idea there's a white line there just by painting over the white crayon, or a clear, like a birthday candle that's got a transparent color. You can use any kind of wax on the paper, and when you paint over it, it leaves the color of whatever the wax or the crayon is.
Yeah, that's similar to the towels we did back in August, I think. So another one of our art projects that we did. Dorothy asked about, do you want the darker colors on first or the light colors, or does it matter?
Actually, that's the best question so far. I should have gone over that. With watercolors, the lightest color is the white of your paper. Don't ever use white watercolor, because unless you're trying to cover something else at the end. But white watercolor paper, it may come in a palette, it may be part of what you buy, but you don't need white watercolor to lighten. Water lightens your color, and the white of the paper is your lightest value. And then you're going to layer to create the darks. So watercolor goes from lightest to darkest, reverse of oil. So if you ever paint in oils, of course with acrylic you can do whatever you want to, but with oils you start dark, create your balance and your values, and then the light hit or the highlight is the very last thing you do. So we're in reverse of oils. Always start with the lightest possible value and you build up. Good?
That's good. Yeah.
Okay.
Good to know.
I probably would not go in here and try to do a background. That's just personal. But I would probably come in here and define the little areas around my pumpkin. See, I've got a couple of little halos, and I don't like those, but they're not wrong. I just like for my colors to meet color, especially when they sit on the surface. So I would probably come back in and really define the pumpkin stops here and the table or the dirt starts here. So I like to have a really defined edge between where one starts and the other stops. If you are ever concerned about highlights not showing up or lighted areas not showing up, what makes your lights the strongest is the dark that's next to them. So some people are afraid of darks and shadows because they're afraid it's going to make it look dull and muddy up the paint. But your highlights are going to look their best when there's a dark next to it, just like the shadow in the center of this pumpkin. So you have to think lights and darks are just as important as the color you choose. So don't be afraid of placing shadows because it's going to accentuate the light parts. Any other questions? But Dorothy, that was the best. Dorothy had the question of the day. That was great.
We'll give her a prize.
Yeah, give her a prize. All right. Are there any other questions about colors? Y'all had a great palette. If you had the palette that Miss Ann purchased for the AARP class, those brand of paints are supposed to be a good quality. And what I would do is if you were wanting to do a second version of this, you can spritz the entire palette of color, or you can just take your brush and put a little drop of paint in each area. You do want to paint with a wet brush, but you don't want to build soggy little valleys of paint in your palette. You can tell, I think, on this palette how it's angled and the paint sit down in the trough. And if you add water from the top of this area, gravity will pull it down, but you don't want to have such a wet palette that you've created liquid paint. You only want the wet of your brush to move across the paint to create the moisture. The lid for your palette or a styrofoam plate or a little white piece of china is where you want to do your mixing. You don't want to necessarily mix. And another little tip, because I think Dorothy's going to need to know this, is you don't want to double dip a dirty brush, especially in an opposite color. I would want to take this yellow and have it on my brush and move to blue, because then I've contaminated that really pretty blue. So always take your yellow to another mixing area. I've got a separate little palette tray here. I would take my yellow here and then rinse my brush a little and go grab my blue and then come over here to mix. But you don't want to take yellow from your palette and go directly to the blue and make your green. You just don't want to double dip your good colors, especially if you invest in one good brush. Sometimes I may have 4 or 5 dirty brushes because I might not want to rinse out this perfect color that I have of my brush. I may lay it aside and get a second brush to start another color. Watercolor is not so hard to recreate, but if you were painting with acrylics or oils, I would probably just save this brush off to the side and get a second brush to start a new color.
Okay, let me ask you this then too. So you've got the paper and the watercolor paints. If it's good to have then the palette, or at least one palette where you can do mixing, or a plastic tray.
Yeah, you can use a styrofoam. This plastic little thing came with my palette.
Okay.
And you can see how it beads up on here. Some of my students favorite watercolor palettes were clear egg trays from the dollar store. And when I first started teaching, we didn't have the money, and I wasn't going to require the kids to go out and buy a $15 palette just for watercolors. But the quality of your paint is more important than the quality of your palette. So if you can invest in better paints, just like the tennis racket, your paints are going to give you a better finished product than worrying about the palette. But those clear, I know last year at Christmas and Easter, they came out with colored versions of those deviled egg trays with the lid. When I bought them way back 20 years ago for the art class, they were clear. And I would put the main colors of the palette, the reds, the yellows, and the blues, maybe a couple of different yellows, in the little deviled egg compartments. And then they would use the tray to mix on, and they could close it up, and they'd be ready for the next day. So if I run across any of the clear ones, I know last year at Christmas they were all red and green, and I couldn't find any clear ones last year. But even the last class I taught here at the Armory, I got really excited because I went on the Walmart.com, and it was when none of us could go shopping, and they had, it was a Better Homes and Gardens, and it was a white ceramic egg platter, and it made the best little dish for having my colors. And then I could mix in the extra one, because I think I have like 20 little pockets to put deviled eggs in. And it was just a nice big oval, and it was heavy, so it didn't move on my art table. And I just covered it with saran wrap when I was through. You wouldn't want to leave your palette out in the open from week to week, because it does get dust, and dust will get in your watercolors, and it's a pain when you go to mix a color, and you will have little, little fuzzes that kind of mix in with your paint sometimes. But if you do invest in a palette, they usually come with an airtight lid. If you invest in watercolor paints and you go to squeeze the tube out and it's like this gluey looking stuff, then that paint's been sitting a long time, but that's the gum arabic. That's what makes the paint and the water move. So if you have paints that you squeeze out and they've been sitting on the shelf a while, just keep squeezing until you get to the paint, because it's the gum arabic that's coming out, and that's the binder that keeps the paint together.
Great. Margaret Barber from the Armory, she's always with us, or always with us on these episodes. She's actually in the background right now. Asked that everybody share their paintings. Yeah. So if you can share them with me, or you can share them directly on here. You can upload them to this Facebook. You can put them in your comments. And I wanted to also tell people that you can share this video with other people. If you've got friends that want to learn how to do any of these but want to learn how to paint, you can share this video with them from our Facebook page, from our YouTube page. You can actually, in the comments, tag your friends on Facebook and tag them, and then they'll be able to watch it directly on their page. So I did want to remind people, but yes, once you paint these, let us know. You can do that, or you can email it to me and I'll put it on there. And I'll put my email up there too if you want that. So you're welcome to email me anytime and let us know what you want, but put it on our Facebook. That would be I'm going to say one more thing. By the time I got this far, I've got dirty water. And if you get dirty water, dump it and get fresh water if you keep painting, so that you don't get the color of the water that sort of contaminates the color you really want. So mine's not bad, but sometimes you'll get just a really brown water depending on the colors you painted with. Technically, you use two things of water, one for your rinsing and one for cleanup, like for when you're wanting to get rid of a certain color. So I just saw how dirty my water was and thought about it. Okay, great. That's good to know. So we are coming to the top of the hour, so we do need to wrap it up. I want to thank you for doing this. This was great fun, and I've learned a lot, because watercolor is, it's something we all do as children. That's right. And we start out probably because you can clean up with it. You can do it with clean up with water and soap, but it is a technique that takes some practice, but can be a lot of fun, and it doesn't have to be perfect. And I think that's what I like, is you see so many different variations of people of their artwork. So I did want to, and then we had Chris Young said thank you too for what you have done. Everybody who is still on, I want to thank you. Remember, we have a concert tonight at 7. Please tune back in. I want to show you a video. It's the end video of our upcoming events. Please stay through and watch those. Again, thank you for joining us. Join us next month on November 17th for sugar scrubs and soap making. We'll do that. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.